we need to talk.
No, fine.
We need to talk about the author a little bit. He's probably the least academic of all the authors that we're doing here. He 8 schools, 10 years. He finally got a degree. He was asked not to come back to 2 of the schools. So he's interesting, but his impact on the youth of the country was immense. He's really known as really the godfather of youth ministries, good or bad. That's what he's known as. And it's a very personal book, like I mentioned. And really, I need to read the letter he wrote to God at the beginning again, just to put it in context, because it's such a great letter. Dear God, frankly, I'm bugged. I know you gave us the Bible, and you did a really nice job, and it's helpful, but you have to admit you left out a lot. I don't mean to offend you, but there are so many questions about you, and I can't find many clues into the answers. What am I supposed to do? I've got all these questions, and I have to ask them because the answers do make a difference in my relationship with you. Can a Christian have unanswered questions? Even a lot of unanswered questions. When I ask these questions in church, I get these funny looks, and some of the looks aren't so funny. He said, the people look at me like there's something wrong with me. Well, is there? I've got to ask one more question. Is thinking a sin? I honestly don't want my faith to be weak. How do I have a strong faith? I guess what I'm looking for is a faith tough enough to handle doubt. Is that possible? Anxiously awaiting an answer. My God, no. He doesn't talk about an answer in the book, but he does talk about a lot of different topics: doubt, evil. And he talks about these firsthand. And he talks about the institutional church. And he talks about how words make a difference. He talks about Christian not being an adjective, but something that it is a noun. And he talks about comparisons that the church and Christians sometimes use to secular, values, and how it shouldn't do that. Then lastly, he ends up, am I a materialist? So they're not totally all going together, but let me tell you what, I'll kind of go through some takeaways I got from the book because I think that's useful. Primary takeaway I got is that God is not afraid of our doubts, feelings, and questions. He welcomes them as through them you become honest, vulnerable, and more open to receive him. Okay? The spiritual journey is not a straight line. It will be a messy journey. There will be ups and downs. Some other takeaways. The first chapter is doubt is not a 4-lettered word. Expect to feel uncomfortable amongst others when you express your doubts and you question God openly. And so just expect that, but you still need to pursue it with a passion because you need to hit it head on and address those doubts. The next chapter was evil is a 4-lettered word. Now, he was getting ready to make a career change to go be a pastor at a small church when his 1.5-year-old daughter developed leukemia. So he hit personal tragedy head on. And he said, personal tragedy can shatter our defenses, laugh at our theology, and penetrate the walls of our faith. But remember, faith honed by pain is different or stronger than the faith that replaced. He said that was certainly true for him. He talks about vicarious evil versus real evil and so forth. He experienced the real. He made a point too about the church. He said, serve God, not the church. He made a point that the church is the people in the church. And the church must ensure that its form allows the God of the church to be glorified. So we need to keep the people in the church, it's the most important thing. And he said the word Christian is not an adjective. An adjective is like paint versus stain, like a veneer versus real wood, and such is our faith. It is to be genuine, our inner core. And he made the statement, everything a Christian does is an expression of his faith. It is to be our core. Everything we do is from the inside out. Our intent and what we do and why what we do is often a lot more important than what we do. He talked about understanding of words. This was the whole book was kind of humorous, to tell you the truth. But he talked about commitment, peace, joy, and love. What do those words mean? He said, I was to be committed to Christ. He said, well, every time I messed up, I felt like I lost my commitment, so I had to recommit. So he was going to the altar like, every other Sunday or so, and he didn't really understand what that means. So he talks about the importance of understanding what, peace and so forth can mean as a Christian. Then he talked about perception-driven societal values can become how we and the church evaluate the truth of our experiences. And he talked about that being perceptually handicapped. He said that the difference Christ makes not only affects what we do, but how we do it, and most importantly, why we do it. be influenced by Christ and not the world. He said, talked about how even the church can start, bigger numbers is better and so forth like that versus, the quality of the numbers. And he talked about, comparison. This is a big point he made. Comparison of our lives with others can make you feel something is wrong with our Christianity. And each one's faith is a very personal thing. It is unique. You will worship different. You will feel different. And it's not a block. He said a lot of the people that he was around in some of the churches he went to seemed to be kind of performance-based, polished, pious type people, which was not necessarily bad in its way, but if you were different, it wasn't necessarily that readily accepted. He said the liberating factor of the gospel is that it frees me from the slavery of competition. God is my judge, and he does not compare me to anyone. Okay. And he thought last he asked the chapter was, am I a materialist? I don't know where that came from, but he threw that in there at the end. And he said, you shouldn't feel guilty about the givens of life. Again, it's not what you have, but it's what you do with what you have. And then he made a point. He said, the one who is not a materialist is the one who honestly feels he deserves nothing. It is one who no longer cares what he has and views his possessions solely in light of their value to the kingdom of God. So really, in summary, I think the book can help one not to be afraid to seek making a firmer basis for your faith by addressing your doubts head on and any other challenges to your faith. And I think some seemingly perfect Christians, as he infers, they may drift through their life without a sufficient introspection about what makes up their faith. And he ends really, he says, he's cynical, but he's one with true Christian hope. And he has a picture of the book, of the portrait of faith with one string hanging taut and strong, and that's Christ. So that's how the book ended.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I knew Mike, growing up out in Southern California. He was in our church and he was a mess, but at least a quasi delightful mess. Okay. And I did say quasi. Okay.
When he meets God in heaven, he's going to say, what a ride.
Yeah. Can't imagine what God will say to him, but no, he was quite a thinker. All right. Well, the next book is Henry Nouwen's The Way of the Heart. And I gave the presentation on that. And it really is a great spiritual classic. I think one of the great, I would call it, one of the half dozen or so greatest spiritual classics of the 20th century. And the theme basically in The Way of the Heart is that spiritual transformation comes through three disciplines. First of all, solitude. And I know that's hard for people who have very busy schedules and very demanding work life and so on. But solitude is so absolutely essential. And again, unlike people that lived, long before us, we have to really make room for that. Silence and prayer. So solitude, silence, and prayer, those are basically the three spiritual disciplines that he emphasizes so much in The Way of the Heart. Now, Nouwen was a Dutch Catholic priest. He was a professor. He was a writer, very successful writer and a theologian. And throughout his career, his primary interests were in psychology, pastoral ministry, contemplative spirituality, and community. And for nearly 2 decades, he taught at the University of Notre Dame, Yale Divinity School, and Harvard Divinity School. He was also very involved in an organization that had certain centers devoted to nurturing and helping people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It was called L'Arche, the Ark, and the center was in Ontario, Canada. So he spent a lot of time every year going up there and ministering to people that, physically and mentally really struggling in life. The prologue to the book, some of the forethoughts that come out of it, quote from C.S. Lewis: "We live in a world starved for solitude and for silence and for privacy, and therefore starved for meditation and true friendship." So C.S. Lewis even recognized this: solitude, silence, and prayer. Blaise Pascal wrote that all evil stems from this: we do not know how to handle solitude. And the point being that what we think and what we do in solitude is the truest reflection of the state of our soul, not what we do and say, in front of other people, but in solitude. The way of the heart is an antidote to shallow pop Christianity. And Lord have mercy, we are inundated with shallow pop Christianity. Some churches worse than others, but it affects all. As far as our basic problem, he says our world has embarked on a suicidal journey. And again, the antidotes would be solitude, silence, and prayer. Two questions he poses: how to make the light shine amid the darkness in our world, and secondly, how to sustain our focus and energy as ministers of Jesus Christ. Part one is all about solitude, and he uses as an example the life and example of Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony lived in the second half of the 3rd century and the first half of the 4th century. And in church one Sunday when he was a young man, he heard the words of Jesus: "Go and sell all that you own and give the money to the poor, and then come and follow me." And so he followed up on that and had one of the greatest ministries probably in all of Christian history. Now one will argue that solitude is the furnace of conversion, and it's also the furnace of transformation or sanctification. And again, for us, we have to make it a priority to seek out periods of solitude and silence and so on. There's a section in the book called The Compulsive Minister, and he makes some remarkable comments. He's talking about our shipwrecked society, and he quotes Thomas Merton. I think a lot of you probably know to some extent a little bit about Thomas Merton. And in Merton's probably most famous book called The Wisdom of the Desert, Thomas Merton wrote, quote, and I've always found this very powerful: "Mainstream society was regarded by the Desert Fathers," in other words, some of the exemplary Christians of the first few centuries. Mainstream society was regarded by the Desert Fathers as a shipwreck from which each single individual had to swim for his life. A shipwreck for which each person has to swim for their life. These were men who believed that to let oneself drift along with the culture, passively accepting the tenets and values of what they knew as society, was purely and simply a disaster. So the argument is that true Christians have to have a countercultural orientation. It's absolutely true. And then he goes on to say that our society is no better than the one in which they were struggling in. He says, our society is not a community radiant with the love of Christ, but rather it's a dangerous network of domination and manipulation in which we can easily get entangled and lose our soul. He says the basic question is whether we have not already been so deeply molded by the seductive powers of our dark world that we've become blind to our own and other people's fatal state and have lost the power and motivation to swim for our lives. And so he talks about we confuse a busy, cluttered life with a fulfilling life. Now, in part two of the book, which is all about silence, he talks about our wordy world. And of course, he's writing like 40 or more years ago. uh, we're so much more wordy and cluttered today. And he's talking about the torrent of words. He says, in our modern world, we are inundated with verbiage. Whenever we go, or wherever we go, we're surrounded by words. Words softly whispered, loudly proclaimed, or angrily screamed, words spoken, recited, or sung. There was a time not that long ago without radios and television, or, social media. Um, and stop signs and so on. There was a time when the advertisements, there was a time without advertisements that covered entire cities with words. Recently, he says, I was driving through Los Angeles and suddenly I had the strange sensation of driving through a huge dictionary. Wherever I looked, there were words trying to, influence me and complicate my life and so on. And he talks about this being a major problem. And then the third section of the book is about prayer. Now, he talks about prayer in two senses. One is discursive prayer, which is what we usually think, and that's us talking to God, okay, presenting our needs and so on. And
Can you do the other one?
can I have 4 more words?
That's actually say it.
Yeah. So he talks about discursive prayer, and that's how we generally think of prayer, us talking to God. But he emphasizes in the book contemplative prayer, and that's when we shut down, our talking and we get quiet and listen for the voice of God to speak to us through the internal presence of the Holy Spirit. And so discursive prayer and contemplative prayer, he says both are absolutely essential. All right, well, let's see, I'm going to move on here. And Dan's book is Francis Schaeffer, A Christian Manifesto. There it is. So Dan, looking forward to your comments.
Bruce, do you have a vaudeville hook or something to drag me? How does this, I'm afraid to ask what happens if I go over, but I'm not going to go over, am I? No, I'm not. Okay, one program note, Jeffrey had hoped that when I did my previous presentation that I had towed slightly closer to the line that he laid out, because he's taught on this book multiple times and he's done it very well. So since I am going to continue with my slightly divergent presentation, I would call your attention to the October 6th email from Jeffrey, which has his shorter 6-page outline, and so you can follow his better. But anyway, William F. Buckley, in his famous book God and Man at Yale, writes that the duel between Christianity and atheism is the most important in the world. Jeffrey thought of an even better theme, and for this book, Christian Manifesto, would be Acts 5:29, where Peter and the other apostles told the Sanhedrin, we must obey God rather than man. So that, yes, we are supposed to bow before our authority, except when they issue directives otherwise. So this book is a bit dated, and the reason I wanted to do my particular presentation is to anchor this book in the history since the book was written, to give it some cultural orientation. So the book is a bit dated. It conveys some of the flavor of its time, but I see this as a good thing. Since 1981, we've seen the spread of Schaeffer's ideas in this and other books and other works, his analysis into a previously apolitical or somewhat naive utopian Christian church, an explosion of books, magazines, talk radio, websites, 1,000 things. We even have World Magazine and even the Babylon Bee conveying a Christian worldview and thought forms. And so the understanding is an outlook of the 1980s religious right figures have acquired an increasingly literate, intelligent voice, becoming large and somewhat powerful. And especially now we see the wide scope and reach of the pro-life movement. Schaeffer insists that the book is a natural outgrowth of his previous works. And this is important because for 40 years, even after he's gone, he stood accused of abandoning his original interests to hang out with televangelists and pursue politics and so on. Thankfully, Schaeffer lived just long enough to address this criticism. Schaeffer died in early 1984, and he wrote that my later books, speaking of books like this, have made specific application of my earlier work to the area of law and the society as a whole, especially in relation to the crucial issues of human life and freedom of religious expression. And so he was criticized for hanging out with people. For example, he had a substantial association with the Jerry Falwell Sr. of the Moral Majority, Thomas Road Baptist Church. I first heard Schaeffer's voice on the Old Time Gospel Hour, which was Falwell's radio program. But Schaeffer says, well, whether we think the Moral Majority has always said the right things or whether we do not, they've certainly done one thing right. They've used the freedom we still have in the political arena to stand against the other total entity, by which he means secular humanism. And indeed, this book is basically about the fact that we as Christians have been looking for most of the 20th century only at bits, what he calls bits and pieces. So you remember the famous dismissal of Clark Gable in Gone with the Wind, where he uses a 4-letter word, and this shocked everybody. And then we were continually shocked for the next few decades about each new thing. But what Schaeffer is saying, look, we're just looking at these little bits and pieces. We're not seeing that an entire worldview, an entire philosophical outlook has been exchanged one for another. Previously, we had a Judeo-Christian, not that everybody was a believer necessarily, or even a devout follower, but everybody lived in this thought form. And Joseph Bottom, I quoted before, he's Catholic, but he writes very fondly of the Protestant outlook that America had for such a long time. He says it gave Americans a code of manners, a state of mind, a mode of being, a political foundation, a national definition. He says that mainline Protestant denominations may have been an intellectually emaciated form of Christendom, as Catholic writers tended to insist, but it was all the Christendom we had in America, and it offered us a vocabulary with which both to criticize the nation and to support it. So what is this alternative that Schaeffer says that has been foisted upon us by the courts, by academia, the media, and Hollywood? What are the social political results of believing that everything is just impersonal matter and or energy shaped by chance, which is the view that Schaeffer says we've been traded into. We've exchanged our birthright for a mess of pottage. And so I quoted Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying, I see no reason for attributing to a man a significance different in kind than that which belongs to a baboon or a grain of sand. New atheist Richard Dawkins tells us that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. And so how do you build, unalienable rights, how do you base, human rights or right and wrong on that? And Schaeffer says, how did we miss this shift, this giant change in our society, looking at these little tiny things and not the big picture? And he says that, as Jeffrey often reminds us, that our Christianity was inadequate. It was defective. It was pietistic, because true spirituality, and Schaeffer wrote a book by that title, covers all of life, all of reality. And again, Jeffrey's often reminds us of this. Schaeffer in the book introduces us to the Presbyterian minister John Witherspoon, to Samuel Rutherford, to Rutherford's concept of lex rex, law is king, not the king is the law. So if law is king, then those in government are themselves under law. They are not autonomous. Schaeffer calls our attention to the contributions of John Locke, and as I mentioned, I'm not competent to gauge their relative importance in the American founding. I'm not the historian that Jeffrey is. I deliver auto parts for a living. But the Prime Minister of England, Horace Walpole, upon hearing the news of colonial rebellion, reportedly said, "Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson." But anyway, the result of all of those fermenting ideas over the centuries led to what we see in the Declaration, which is a concept of unalienable rights endowed by the Creator. And indeed, if the government gives us rights, it can take them away just as easily. Indeed, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, in his inaugural address, reminded us that, quote, the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. This is the understanding. And so, yes, So yes, the First Amendment, which sets out here's religion, here's God, here's the government, but the radical separation doctrine foisted on us by the courts, Schaeffer says, is not valid, and he gives reasons for that. I quoted the chairman of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, Martin Castro, this was under the Obama administration, when he said the phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy, so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any form of intolerance. Today, as in the past, religion is being used as both a weapon and a shield by those seeking to deny others equality. So this is how they're programmed to just wave away constitutional free exercise. And President Obama and Secretary Clinton took to using the phrase freedom of worship. But freedom of worship is something you haven't even in prison, whereas constitutional free exercise says we can build Christian schools, colleges, hold services, hire and fire clergy, print and distribute books like this one. And so Schaeffer says our evangelical leaders let us get to this place because they forgot their own heritage, that the great revivals of the past led almost immediately to things like schools, orphanages, and projects of social reform. Schaeffer talks about church-state issues that were contested or about to be contested or likely to be contested, and argues that he has a major theme on the fact that the 1980 election, which had just happened when he wrote Reagan had just been inaugurated January of 81, and this book is from 81. And he talks about that we have an open window because of this turn to conservatism. But then he asks, well, what if this turn to conservatism is basically bogus? What if people just wanted better results in the economy? Then our open window may soon close. And what will happen, and what he suggests will happen, is that we will see the rise of a manipulative elite that will just tell us what to do. And so Schaeffer again argues that we must not only fight against particular bits and pieces, but we must somehow dislodge the destructive humanistic view has on our government and law. Using this newfound freedom, Christianity would compete in the free marketplace of ideas without being subject to a hidden censorship. We must show it to be the truth, he says, by teaching, by life, and by action. And obviously, a big chunk of the book has to do with how far do we go in terms of civil disobedience. And that's a very interesting discussion. Schaeffer's accused of being very radical in his argument, but if you actually read the book, he's like, well, if you were living in Nazi Germany, you would probably want to hide Jews in your attic. And it's like, that's not, he's not overthrowing the government. He says we might, if our taxes are going to abortion, we might have a tax protest and stop paying our taxes. Now that's radical, but it's not violent. Anyway, thank you very much.
We've done 5 presentations in 40 minutes. That's pretty good.
Oh, yeah, that's superb, actually. Yeah. Dan, the sentence in that book that I've always found so impressive was he understood that people like Jerry Falwell and others are far from ideal or perfect. But remember the sentence where he says, if you find problems in their approach and their agenda and so on, then do it better yourself.
Exactly right.
But do something.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Don't just criticize. Yeah. Get actively involved. Yeah. Well, next book is Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And so Scott Davis is going to be joining us. And Scott's about 70 miles away, so you'll have to talk real loud.
Well, can everybody hear me right now?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. It's I'm sorry. The book is
Yep.
Mark Knowles, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. I'm sorry.
No.
Just been rereading Amusing Ourselves to Death. But,
There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me all right. I apologize for not being there in person. But yes, Mark Knoll, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And so Mark Knoll was a history professor. He taught at Wheaton and also Notre Dame. And so his book basically deals with the idea that in evangelicalism, we just don't do a sufficient amount of thinking as followers of Jesus. And so That's basically his thesis. The big quote from the book is, there is not much of an evangelical mind. That's the scandal. And so, and more to that, he says, to kind of flesh that out a bit, by the evangelical life of the mind, I mean more the effort to think like a Christian within a specifically Christian framework across the whole spectrum of modern learning. So the idea is apply our minds as Christians. The idea is to apply our minds as Christians to all aspects of reality, essentially, and that we have failed to do that. And there are reasons why we failed to do that, which lie in the history of our country and the history of evangelicalism as a movement. Um, and he says in chapter 2 why the scandal matters. It matters because of, and several people have mentioned this tonight, it's the idea that Christianity should be understood as a worldview. So it's a worldview, and so it affects everything, not just this idea of, trusting Jesus and going to heaven when you die, but it's a comprehensive worldview. So it affects every aspect of reality, and we should have a theory and a way of interaction with all those things as Christians. So that's why it's so important for us to get this right. A couple of quotes here I thought were helpful. Um, J. Gresham Machen says, "We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed in winning only a straggler here or there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation or of the world to be controlled by ideas which prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion." So people say, well, it's good for you. You guys are off doing your Christian thing. Well, that's the exact wrong impression we want to give. We don't want that. We want to help people understand this affects every aspect of reality. So it's a very factual religion, I guess is the right word. It's a worldview that's rooted in truth. Okay. So what he does then is he goes into um, this trying to understand how this happened historically, because he's a church historian. And so that's the great contribution I think he gives here, is to try to assess how it happened historically. And so he goes through that and talks about kind of the founding of really prior to the revolution. He's talking about Jonathan Edwards and how, as Christians at that time, the foundation for our faith was essentially revelation. And then with the American synthesis is what he calls, and the rise of the revolution in the American nation as we understand it today, they we had to do some compromising, so we brought in the Enlightenment, and we shifted the real foundation there to reason, which was fine for a while, and I think it still could be considered fine, because we do believe Christianity is comprehensive, and we could get to God through reason as well. But and that worked for a while. But what happened was, over time, the scientific revolution happened along the 1870s or so. And with the foundation of the culture being reason and rationality, and then with the rise of the scientific revolution and other various factors in the development of the United States, it just became very, very hard for people to align the Christian faith with reason. Reason, science kind of co-opted reason. And so when that happened, the church wasn't able, they didn't have the intellectual ability to withstand the attack, essentially, of the secularists, the atheistic people that were in science. So we kind of gave the mind at that point over to the scientists, atheistic scientists, secularists, and we just relinquished it. We didn't have the ability as Christians to defend our worldview anymore. Not that it couldn't be defended, but I think that the climate was certainly not conducive to it, and the church didn't have it wasn't up to the task at that time. So then what happened was the church just gave that up and went off into several other directions. Three of them that he mentions are Keswick theology, Pentecostalism, and dispensationalism. And all of that was kind of under the umbrella of fundamentalism. So we know pretty much what fundamentalism was. It was just a kind of a movement in the history, and there's remnants of it even today, where um, I guess it's just a kind of a void of the mind to some degree, and a movement away off to Pentecostalism and dispensationalism, and he goes on and on about those different movements. Are we getting the 2-minute warning? Got it. Okay. And so that goes on today, even now, and evangelicalism has been, um, you know, impacted by that greatly. So all of us are products of that, which was to me was a very critical realization. The way we think about everything in church has been impacted by our history. And so we have to be aware of that. We have to minimize the bias that we have sometimes with that in mind to really get back to where we need to be in terms of using our minds. And so that was to me a big realization that was very important. And he goes on through the book and talks about, is an intellectual renaissance underway? This was written in the 90s. So in the 90s, he had some hope for that. And then the book was reprinted in about 3 years ago. And he had a preface and an afterword where he says, I'm really, he said, I'm pretty much giving up on the evangelical mind. So not almost, he says, but pretty much given up, but it's only an almost. So I tended to disagree with him. I think there's a great amount of intellectual renaissance in the church today, not in the church maybe, but in Christianity, but it's having a hard time being filtered down to the church. And that's kind of where we are now, I think. A lot of good stuff out there. But it's for many reasons, it doesn't get down to the church. And I just wanted to say, Bruce, I think your presentation is a great segue into this because a lot of the stuff you were talking about to me is right on track with that, particularly Stephen Meyer and some of those guys. So I'll turn it over to you.
Right on time.
Searching for Bruce's book. Okay. Yeah. All right, next up is Bruce's presentation or review on the soul science.
The timer, Bruce.
I'll be counting out of my breath.
I think Dan.
No, in my usual.
8 minutes.
I took up, at the tender age of 78 or something like that, I took up the flute. And I'm taking lessons from a dear friend of ours whom we known for quite some number of years. And she wrote in my little lessons book, she said, obsess over quality of sound. Yeah. And I said, Anna, no one has ever asked me to obsess over something. I sort of do that by myself.
Okay.
All right. I will run the clock, he says, if I can find the clock.
How many minutes are you supposed to have?
Huh? I get an hour and a half.
Wait a
Okay. Here we go. It was really with the Enlightenment, which was 1685 to like 1815, about 130 years, that serious intellectuals began a frontal assault on Christianity. And science was often an innocent bystander, but at the same time was a handmaiden to these attacks because picked up scientific discoveries to use it as to attack Christianity and Christian beliefs. To the extent that histories of science were written, they were written in what came to be known as a positivist approach. You assign the value, you assess the value of what someone believed years ago by looking at what you believe today. If they were similar, the historical figure was a hero. It's very simple, right? Works very well. If not, he or she was dismissed or at worst maligned. So when Galileo threw his weight around promoting Copernicanism or heliocentrism, since that is what we believe today, he was a hero. And the poor, benighted Catholic Church who opposed him was cast as the villain. This resulted in writing history that opened with the Greco-Roman world praised as a golden age of reason. I mean, their togas, it's lovely. Moved to the Middle Ages, denounced as a dreary period of ignorance and oppression, huddled in your little, thatched roof house in a smoky room, right? And ended with the Enlightenment, heralded as a revival of ancient wisdom and rationality. Most of us are mature enough here to recall the term Dark Ages, which thankfully is conspicuously absent these days because we found out that they were doing a lot of really good stuff. But such writers as wrote these histories, right, can rightly be called polemicists for secularism. And that's what they were really doing, using science as a cudgel to beat the church. History writing got better when we started to assess historical figures by asking whether their beliefs were understandable given the knowledge that they had at their disposal. To this day, Richard Dawkins can still dismiss Thomas Aquinas's proofs for the existence of God by completely misunderstanding them. And so we are not totally out of the woods on this issue yet. Now, in The Soul of Science, Percy Thackston's way of setting the record straight, showing that science was, and for want of a better word, religion, had been co-workers in creating what we think of today as the scientific enterprise. We use the word metaphysics because it got a broad applicability to the different types of belief systems present across the history of science. If there was a single question that these different belief systems addressed, it was the relationship between God and the world, often focusing on purpose, or if you're into Greek, teleology. Aristotelianism started all off by recognizing purpose as a primary component of things. It was simply in the nature of smoke that it would rise and of a ball to roll downhill. Neoplatonism, which came several hundred years later, a religion concocted from a base of Platonism, was many things over its existence, but primarily answering the purpose question by positing a world soul which powered otherwise inanimate matter. When Neoplatonism was feeling inclined to the idea of the divine, that world soul could be seen as associated in some ways to God, but that was not necessary. The final system we looked at was world machine, or materialism, what arose out of the Enlightenment. This is often mistakenly pinned on Newton. He didn't believe that, but they whitewashed his writings. We would explain the world by taking it apart into smaller and smaller pieces, often called reductionism. Just life is just chemistry. Chemistry is just physics, and physics is the grounding substance of everything. The more things we learn to explain, the less we seem to have any need for God. Explanations were most often couched in mathematical terms, and we were very confident in our own future. But our idol, mathematics, modeled on the highly structured example of Euclidean geometry and the deductive or axiomatic methods of deductive logic and set of basic postulates and self-obvious postulates, began to show its cracks. Geometry was not as tight a system as we had thought. Hume undermined our understanding of causation, and we began to doubt our minds. The writers say he took his axe to the axiomatic method. Right? Kant tried to save us by saying that knowledge was only in our minds, but then it couldn't really be expected to faithfully represent the real world. So just what was man's role in the scientific enterprise? How could man, with his notoriously unreliable mental faculties, ever reach for truth? Into that indecision, came first Einstein saying that the two great pillars of existence, time and space, were in fact variables, that the only real absolute was the speed of light. This was followed by quantum physics, which appeared to tell us that our hope of finding a deterministic underpinning at the base of reality was itself an illusion. We had to write the formulas of physics now as probability statements, since it appeared that it was not possible to know the underpinnings of reality in the way we had previously known things. And then came the seemingly infinite complexity of the foundation of biology. It seemed that the instructions needed to build a human could fit on a dot the size of a period. Reflecting on the problem of quantum physics in particular, our authors say it is perhaps more accurate to say that physics had merely recaptured its true nature. After all, through most of its history, physics had been deeply intertwined with questions of metaphysics. Historical figures such as Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and Leibniz offered their scientific theories within a context of philosophical and theological discussion. The new physics was merely brought us out of a temporary aberration of the Enlightenment, that we could separate man from all this and do a mathematical model of the world, right? And has reunited science with the broader fabric of human knowledge, right? If we are going to find our way out of this, we're going to have to recapture the guarantee that God gave us that the world was orderly and that we had the ability to understand it. So 2 takeaways. Metaphysics has always been with us and still is as we ponder the meaning of what we are learning. And after years of trying to limit the role of man in understanding the world, turning it into emotionalist mathematics, we are beginning to see a revival. We are the ones who interpret the findings of science. And though that doesn't always lead to universal agreement, it does put mankind's type of mind and intellect back to work. And with it, revives all those unanswered questions about meaning and purpose, and of course, about God. I like to think that the world was in black and white 2D and human beings make it technicolor, right? And suppose just for a moment that this participation in understanding the world was exactly what we were put here for in the first place. After all, God asked Adam to name the animals, and we're still at it.
We've got 13 minutes, okay, which I won't take it all. Yeah, thanks. All right, one more, and this would be Paul Vitz's book, Psychology is Religion, the Cult of Self-Worship. One of the best titles and subtitles of any of these, I believe. There we go. All right, Paul Vitz. And another book just pregnant with profundity. I don't know where that ever came from. All right, so the thesis of the book. Paul Vitz writes, psychology has become a religion, a cult of the self, and an intensely held worldview as well. I mean, the whole world revolves around me, apparently. Contemporary psychology is a form of secular humanism based on the rejection of God and the worship of self. I think any Christian, studying psychology or psychiatry absolutely needs to be aware of this, that they're going to have to think independently from so much that they're being indoctrinated with, in graduate school and whatever. So as far as some main points, Vitz's book exposes psychology's, quote, deep commitment to narcissism, deep commitment to narcissism, egoism, self-worship, and the individual isolated self, or as I call it, this is him speaking, selfism. Psychology as religion is deeply anti-Christian, not just non-Christian, but anti-Christian. And he talks a little bit about his conversion, which was, I thought, very, very interesting. Just a brief recap. His conversion to Christianity was not dramatic, nor was it any kind of mystical experience. As he puts it, just a great deal of intense emotional turbulence. You know, anybody that really thinks about life and all has to go through periods of intense emotional turbulence associated with the collapse of my secular ideals, accompanied by a quietly growing change of heart and mind. He goes on to say this process started sometime in 1972, and at some point since then, I discovered that I was a Christian and my life had been turned around. You know, I think if we were to go around, everybody share your personal, you know, testimony and so on. For some, it might be very dramatic. And for others, it really is, you know, kind of an evolutionary, pardon the expression, an evolutionary experience where your heart is attuned toward God. And at a certain point, he illuminates your heart and mind, and you realize, I really am committed to serving, you know, God through faith in Jesus Christ. He goes on to say that my life had been turned around. It happened to a totally unprepared, recalcitrant, secularized psychologist. Becoming a Christian provided me with a dramatically different view of psychology. Well, thank God. Over time, he began interacting with, quote, a rich and innovative Christian intellectual community. Boy, what a blessing that is. The first chapter, he talks about major theorists and people like Carl Jung and Eric Fromm and Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, people like that. I won't waste time going back through that. Chapter 2 deals with self-theory. The title is Self-Theory for Everybody. And in that chapter, basically the thesis is that humanistic psychology actively promotes personal idolatry and narcissism. Religion focuses, he says, on ultimate concerns. Self-centered humanistic psychology is a religion of immediate gratification. Some of the main points here would be the cult of self-esteem. Says, what's wrong with the self-esteem agenda? He says, well, it's often emotion-based and disconnected from reality. It builds up a false sense of ego gratification, but it is just a false sense. And then, you know, occasionally we're struck with the realities of our situation, the realities of life, and we realize we've just been living in an imaginary fantasy world of total self-absorption. So, chapter 3 deals with selfism as bad science. This was a very, very useful chapter. The thesis here was selfism is secular humanism, and it is a pseudo-religious cult. It's not a branch of science. The fundamental problem of selfism is the denial of original sin, which we just keep coming back to that, don't we? He in that section of the chapter, he talks about the evidence strongly suggests that benefits from psychotherapy. And he says, yeah, a lot of people go, you know, for psychotherapy and counseling, and it's actually quite helpful. Not sure that would be most, but certainly it does happen. And he says the evidence strongly suggests that benefits from psychotherapy come from common factors found in every kind of therapy. Major factors include the commitment of the client to therapy. In other words, the client is serious about, you know, any wisdom that's going to be dispensed and following it. So it comes from the commitment of the client to therapy and the therapist's positive support of the client. Now, he says that this is combined with the ability gently to challenge the client's distorted thinking and to facilitate positive changes. And so he readily admits that psychology, psychiatry, therapy can be very, very helpful if it's honest and if it's in touch with reality. chapter 5, but he'll say that, by the way, that's true in any area of life, even when you're discussing your problems or challenges with friends. It's the same way. If they really care about you, it can be very, therapeutic, very healing, in fact. Chapter 5 is selfism in the family, and this was a real interesting chapter in that it talked about how that self-centeredness, of course, wreaks havoc in families, obviously. Chapter 6, self-theory and schools. And he talks in this chapter primarily about the fad of values clarification. Now, I think that's a term that's come and gone, but I'm sure it's been replaced by things just as odious. And he says that he's talking about the corrupting influence of secular humanistic values clarification on education. Values clarification calls for individualistic self-expression and a rejection of traditional religious-based moral and ethical values. He says the purpose of values clarification is, quote, to engage students and teachers in the active formulation and examination of values. It does not teach a particular set of values. Well, actually, it does. It teaches secular humanism and egoism, but nonetheless, they would deny that. Goes on to say there is no sermonizing or moralizing. The goal is to make students aware of their own feelings. That's what matters. Their own ideas, their own beliefs, so that the choices and decisions they make are conscious and deliberate based on their own value system. So that's the goal. And you look at, the wreck that modern education is, and I think it's really, zeroed in on.
Thinker, author, and talk show host Dennis Prager, when he would go around to college campuses, including Christian college campuses, one of the questions he would pose is, if a stranger was drowning in front of you and your pet, which would you rescue? Wow. And it's like 90-10 that they go rescue the pet.
Oh.
Including at the Christian, supposedly Christian college.
But those were only pets with souls, right? Only a pet that has a soul,
Yeah, so I'm not sure I want to know what the students' values are.
Okay. So anyway, human beings are innately good, innately rational. So the only real authority on how to live one's life is by way of your intuition and your feelings. Go with your feelings. And where should students get their values, by the way? From pop culture, popular culture.
Feelings. I'm just thinking, when was this written?
Psychologist religion, originally in the 80s.
And look how that is so prevalent today. What are you feeling?
Sure. Yeah, oftentimes teachers don't even ask students, what do you think? It's all about, how do you feel about
Well, all the
this?
gender, all of that, is all about your feelings.
That's
What do
right.
you feel?
That's
What do you feel like today?
That's right. So he talks about why values clarification was so popular. And again, as I said, I guess values clarification is a thing of the past now to some extent, but I'm sure those values have influenced whatever the most recent pop culture educational fad may be. So comments, questions, anything. Again, we've never done a course like this before, and I think going forward, I wouldn't do it again. Because these books are so rich and they really require more time. So I think next time we have a part 2 to this course, we'll cut it down and give people at least a couple of sessions to present their book and all. Yes, Ally?
This book, is it something that, is it very Christian, or is it something you could give to someone who is interested in psychology, but?
I think it's a brilliant critique of psychology. Obviously, he's a Christian.
But is it like in there a lot about, like, is he more analyzing it, or is he comparing it?
I think it's a very, very fair analysis and critique. of modern psychology and the trends, the fads in modern psychology. So I don't think any non-Christian who's serious about dealing with, reality, I don't know that they would be offended by the book at all. And for Christians, it's great. I think any Christian going into that field absolutely should read this book. Yeah, Bruce?
Two things. We have a little saying posted on one of our bulletin boards at home. It says, "You're the one who's confused. Why are you looking inside?"
Yeah.
And so I think about that. But what I thought about was that, actually, we throw around the word seminar, I use it a lot and stuff, but it doesn't really. Normally they're lecture series, they're not seminars. You certainly know what a seminar is as a college professor. A seminar typically is where you graduate students together who have some substance in the topic and they participate and they present and they bring ideas forward and you have conversations and discussions. And so the teacher acts more as a Socratic kind of
Right.
leader of what goes on. And I find it because we've had by my we've had 3 books on psychology, basically.
Mhm.
Frankel and Reef and Vitz
Mhm.
are really psychological. There's only one really on practice. Iaconelli was sort of more, you could maybe put him in the, but certainly way of the heart could be put in as spiritual practice.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, to an extent.
And then there's some cultural, like the Christian Manifesto and the Scandal of the American Mind, and the evangelical mind and so forth.
Mhm.
But it'd be interesting to sort of, I don't suggest we do this, but I mean, if this were a true seminar, we'd sit back and we'd say, well, let's take 3 of these are sort of together. Let's talk about the 3 of them together,
Yeah.
what are the different ones saying? How do they connect with each other and what supports and, what kind of source. So it's a
Right.
real, there's a lot of stuff there that we haven't had a chance to gnaw on the bone.
Yeah.
But all that takes preparation and everything else, and we'll have lives to live and stuff like that. But anyway.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're quite right. And I loved teaching seminars at Georgia State and all. Usually it's a class of, I don't know, a dozen or 15 or something like that, not 150. And could really, explore in depth certain topics. Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that Frankel and Reef are Jews. And Reef started out, like from the 60s, he had abandoned, he said, I'm never going to be, but by the end of his life, he had become more conservative and was more
Mhm.
contemplative,
Mhm.
But I think it's just so interesting that, like, we know as Christians, we have the full revelation, so we can see things clearly. They have so much. They have so much of the same worldview, but not completed.
That's right.
They analyze it, and so it's so interesting to read it from their perspective.
Mhm.
'Cause
It is.
It's more analytical.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let's see, there's also another book in the group here that is that correlates to that. What's the other one? Let's see. Overlooking it anyway, there's one more. Well, they at least have that Old Testament, or let me put it this way, they have that traditional Judaistic
That passed down,
mindset.
they
Yeah,
are honoring God,
yeah.
because when that gets
Yeah.
passed down for generations, it's there.
Hmm.
Even if you're
Mhm.
kind of denying it, there's still.
Well, a disproportionate number of people in psychology and psychiatry and all are of Jewish heritage. And of course, many of them hate their heritage. But some see great value in it. Yeah. Any other thoughts on anything we've talked about? Thanks to those of you who gave your presentations this evening, and very, very valuable. And again, if I had this course to do over again, we'd limit it to fewer books so we can go into each one in more depth. But I really appreciate you being involved in the course. I hope it's been helpful. And for those of you who are involved in book clubs, which I know quite a few of you are, hopefully this has given you some good ideas for subsequent books to discuss. But of course, there's really a lot of good material coming out in just the last few years. And so I know it's a matter of prioritization more than anything. So, well, anything before we, oh, well, yeah, thank you all. And John Allegra, you're going to be living near Asheville, but I'm sure you'll still be coming back every week for our
Zoom, right?
just buy a fast car. And those of you who have been so faithful. Yeah, it's all downhill. I know. So anyway, you'll surely be missed. All will. And those of you who joined us online as well, great to see you and really appreciate your involvement. Well, let's take our calling very seriously to be ambassadors for Christ and sources of truth and love and beauty. And we have let's have as much of an influence even in our own churches as possible. So good being with you all. Blessings on the rest of your week. We have my favorite, I have to say it's my favorite holiday coming up, and that's Thanksgiving. Why is it my favorite? Because it's the least commercialized.
Yeah.
At least Halloween's over.
There's also that. But
My garage.
of course,
Skeletons.
of course, Christmas and Easter are sacred, absolutely, but they've been so commercialized. So thank God we have Thanksgiving to celebrate in just a few weeks. So good being with you. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah, yeah.